or global science, where the North will essentially manage the planet from a scientific perspective and then try to enact particular policies. Uh, in the United States and globally, there have been a number of issues that have really stood at the forefront, and some of these issues, in terms of contamination and loss, occurred early on. Some of these are ongoing. Many would point to Rachel Carson's publishing of Silent Spring um, as a real defining moment in the environmental movement as a whole. I think that you could also make the arguments for Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and perhaps a potential other book, a few other books, maybe Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, even, you could argue to a certain extent. Nevertheless, many do point to Rachel Carson's sounding the alarm about the relatively silent spring that would be experienced in the United States because songbirds had been exposed to DDT, the relative thinning of eggshells, and the subsequent lack of young birds, young songbirds, come spring. We see more recent work with Theo Coburn and her work on endocrine disruptors in the book Our Stolen Future, which emerged in the late 1990s, looking at things like the ability of the endocrine system in humans to be disrupted through the rather prevalent use of a number of different chemicals in the environment overall. And Colburn and others have argued for the development of the precautionary principle in approach to the utilization of particular substances which are just assumed to be safe overall. We see increasingly within the Mississippi Delta the flow of massive quantities of nutrients, nitrogen in particular, down the Mississippi from the Great Plains. A lot of these nutrients are not caught on the field. A lot of them are dispersed in liquid or gas form and work their way through the ecosystem rather quickly, especially if they're applied incorrectly or applied in close proximity to water, which will carry it down. This leads to algal blooms in the Mississippi, in the Gulf of Mexico, right at the mouth of the Mississippi. And you see here the zone of hypoxia develop, where essentially the nitrogen causes algal blooms. The algae will take in the oxygen, reducing the total amount of dissolved oxygen available, and hence not making this available to other organisms. And you have a relatively sterile environment with these algal blooms overall. A lot of the fisher folk in New Orleans and surrounding regions have really called attention to some of these issues with a continued marginalization of the lower Mississippi and Louisiana as a whole, particularly after the BP oil spill, as well as Hurricane Katrina. You see rising sea level overall, the rather imminent threat in coastal cities of increasing storm surges, the increasing power of hurricanes. We see conflict, as Sandra Postal talks about in her book, where she's looking at the wars that have been started over water, and some recent anthropologists have also talked about the conflicts around water, such as Amber Yoder-Woodich out at Arizona State University. We also see issues of contamination that occur in environments which are very far removed from industrial processes. This has to do with the global flow of both air and water currents, which deliver many of these contaminants, as well as bioaccumulation. And you see in many higher organisms along the food web, food chain, that the concentration of things like methylmercury poisoning, for example, or methylmercury in fish in Alaska has been a major concern recently. And so it raises interesting questions about the balance of attaining and consuming traditional foods from both a cultural continuity and a nutritional perspective, as well as overall food security perspective, to the potential of warning people about the potential contamination in the foods that they're consuming, and that they could potentially do more harm than good in consuming some of these traditional foods. Two, we see not only these sort of long-term background non-point sources of pollution, but also really discrete acute events that have been framed as disasters and as environmental disasters. One of these more recently has been the explosion and meltdown of the reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the Deepwater Horizon BP oil spill in the Gulf Coast, with varying reports about how much of this was actually reported or analyzed and the long-term impacts of that. Gregory Button writes about this quite a bit in his book Disaster Culture, where he talks about, as initially as a journalist and then transitioning into anthropology, he talks about the relative lack of access to disaster sites and how this is controlled both not only by government officials, but also in particular corporate individuals that control access to particular disaster locations. We saw the devastating effects of Hurricane Katrina and still the long-term recovery and consequences in New Orleans and surrounding communities. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince of William Sound in Alaska, and the continued finding presence of oil, the continued impacts that this has on subsistence. There was quite a bit made of the cleanup of the Exxon Valdez. I don't know if anybody might recall that there were a number of Dawn commercials, I believe it was, where these birds were being cleaned off. But many of these ended up dying later anyway, unfortunately. And still today, if you go in and around Prince William Sound, you pick up rocks, you can still see the oil that's there. The press was brought to a very particular area and flown over a very particular area that was cleaned, but by no means was the full extent of the oil cleaned up in Prince of William Sound. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster in 1986. You guys will be watching a film at the end of the semester that I made on Chernobyl, which examines the impacts of Chernobyl both in the short term and long term for the former Soviet Union and now Ukraine. And then a local occurrence in 1962, the Centralia fire right down the road, which during this fall of 2014, we have a number of students that are working in the environmental anthropology and regional sustainability class on a class project dealing with Centralia and coal overall. And then something that really raised some alarm bells as well, I would argue, right there with Rachel Carson's work, was when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in both 1952 and 1969. And it really became much more of a story in 1969. In fact, I believe that some of the images from 1952 were replicated on the 1969 covers of Time magazine to illustrate the full extent of the fire. In a legal sense, there have been many policy responses to this, to these different ideas and conceptualizations of nature. The National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 and the Wilderness Act of 1964 both sought to create places and spaces of nature. You see a number of regulations, regulatory bodies come into play. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example. You also see the development of the Clean Air Act and the First Earth Day, all in 1970. So a lot of this is taking place during the Nixon administration. The Clean Water Act in 1972, CERCLA, which regulates Superfund sites, and then the big push at the international level with the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, where the Convention on Biological Diversity, amongst a number of other key international documents in terms of global environmental management, were initially pushed through at that summit in Rio de Janeiro. So what role for anthropology in all of this? You have the cultural ecology of Julian Stewart that we mentioned earlier in our semester, with Robert Manners' discussion of population and overpopulation, and this idea of multilineal evolution and looking at specific context in terms of environmental resources and social systems. You have the neo-functionalism of Marvin Harris and Roy Rappaport. Marvin Harris looked at the sacred cattle. Roy Rappaport, Harris looked at sacred cattle in India. Rappaport looked at ritual regulation of pigs and men in Kayako and the ceremony that was conducted, and ceremonial warfare as well to control populations of individuals amongst the Simbaga and Papua New Guinea. You have the political ecology of wolf, structural violence of Galtong that we mentioned earlier in the semester. Laura Nader's notion of studying up or examining issues from a broad perspective, from studying those who are in positions of power rather than those that are more marginalized. The development of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge. A lot of this work comes out of the University of Georgia, and it still does today. Initially, the work of Brent and Louise Berlin, looking at ethnoecology and a lot of cognitive anthropology in terms of classificatory systems were put into play here. The critique of development coming from Arturo Escobar, examining the essentially the top-down management from the north to the south and what is actually entailed in development, particularly large-scale environmental development as a whole. In the 1970s, you see the emergence of disaster anthropology. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the semester in terms of the context of Hurricane Katrina. Oliver Smith's work initially comes from his initial field site where a volcanic eruption and essentially pyroclastic mud flow ends up taking out the community he was going to work in, and he looks at how the community rebuilds itself over a number of decades overall. And some of the things that anthropologists are generally interested in that crosses many of our subfields is our place in the environment. And so really thinking about this nature-culture dichotomy as a social construction, I think it's a really valuable role for anthropology overall. And so if we consider that, we'll talk about wilderness and parks as a whole. President Johnson, on signing the Wilderness Act, stated, "If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it." And in the Wilderness Act, it defines the wilderness as as in contrast to those areas where man, in his own works, dominate the landscape, and is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Now the idea of wilderness calls for a sharp break or sharp dichotomy between human beings and the natural world. Under the Wilderness Act, we are fundamentally outside of nature in any of our forms, in any of our cultural forms, in any of our material utilization. However human beings are in the environment, they're essentially a corrupting influence. And that somehow, if human beings are outside of the environment, then this will allow human beings who visit these particular locations to see the world as it was. And this makes the assumption, of course, that there were landscapes that existed from time immemorial that have been untrammeled by human beings, that human beings have not been deliberate actors, deliberate agents in the environment of environmental change through things like environmental modifications. We see this, of course, extensive documentation, not only in industrial archaeology, where you look at post-industrial sites and conduct archaeological field work there, but we see this in contemporary hunting and foraging societies who modify the environment quite a bit when they interact with it, utilizing extensive traditional ecological knowledge that the Berlins talk about. So this idea of wilderness is very much a social construction, and it bears very little to the actual underlying biological realities that seek to segregate human beings from being a part of the environment as a whole.